Great. So, Assalamu alaikum and good evening, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us for our third Impact Speaker Series. Today, we are honored to have Maleeka Bokhari amongst us, and our topic is gender-based violence in Pakistan, rethinking legal interventions. So, Maleeka, for those of you who do not know, is a barrister and a member of Parliament from the Pakistan Tehreek-e-Insaf. He is currently serving as Parliamentary Secretary for the Ministry of Law and Justice in Pakistan and is responsible for the legislative business in Parliament. He's at the forefront of the government's law reform agenda and part of the legal team drafting the action plan for the women in the justice system. He obtained her LLB honors in 2007 and was awarded the Helena Kennedy Scholarship Award for her academic achievements. She is currently admitted as an advocate of the High Courts in Pakistan. She's a fierce human rights advocate and passionate about law reform and gender equality. Today's session will be moderated by Zainab Samtash. Zainab is an advocate of the High Courts of Pakistan as well. She has an LLB honors degree with first-class distinction from the University of London and an LLM from Harvard Law School, where the focus of her study was comparative constitutional law and political theory. She has previously worked with a top-ranked Karachi-based law firm, practicing mainly in constitutional law and tax law. In addition, she has served as a visiting faculty in various law schools and is currently a member of the National University of Science and Technology's Internal Review Board. Thank you to everyone for joining us today. Once again, Maleeka, for taking out the time to be with us. We know how busy you are. Zainab will be moderating the event and will be setting the scene for us. And normally how we function is we have a substantial time dedicated to question and answer from our members so that they can really ask the speaker on the issues of the day. So Zainab, over to you.
Right. Hi, Maleeka. Thank you for joining us. I'll get straight into it. The first question that I would like to ask you about is regarding the law reform agenda that the PTI government has been pursuing ever since they came into office. And the first thing that I observe when I look at this law reform agenda is that it is quite ambitious, especially with respect to the kind of reforms that the government is looking to introduce in the justice sector, and also with regards to specific focus on women and preventing violence against women, etc. Now, my question to you is that these are all issues that Pakistan has been facing for the last 70 years, and there have been various efforts from various different sectors, whether it be government or the private sector, to try and address these concerns as much as possible. However, let's just say a very effective strategy has not yet come up, observably come up. My question to you is, and now that this government is also has also started, is working on the same lines, what is it that this government is doing differently, and how is it that you are prioritizing issues on this law reform agenda? What is it that takes precedence over something else? And if a prioritization of issues has been done, what are the considerations on which you have based this prioritization?
Thank you, Zainab. First of all, I'd like to apologize for being late. Then that's a very, very important question, because PTI as a political party has come in with on the mandate of improving the justice system, of ensuring that the common man, every common Pakistani, has access to justice in the same way that any powerful or somebody who is affluent has, to make better sense of it, that nobody in any way is undermined when they come into contact with the justice system on the basis of their social status, on the basis of their caste, creed, or ethnicity. And that is the primary agenda that we led for 22 years. So when we came into government, justice, reforming the justice system was an important aspect of what we wanted to deliver for the people of this country. When we came into government, the Prime Minister put forward a 100 days agenda. Reforming the legal system was a primary component of that 100-day agenda, starting with ensuring that women get their inheritance rights in their country, to ensuring that the criminal justice system works effectively for everybody, that the civil procedure code in this country does not stagnate cases. It ensures that people's rights are delivered effectively. And these are the root causes and issues that we identified whilst we were in opposition. So when we came into power and the Ministry of Law and Justice started doing its work, we ensured that we promulgate laws which resolve issues, that resolve lacunas, and also look at the system more holistically. Instead of coming up with knee-jerk legislation, as governments often do, we look at the system holistically, identify problems, and ensure that every time we enact a piece of law, it has a gendered perspective to it. And that helps if there is a woman in public office, and also if we have men in public office who understand the needs of the women and girls of this country. The first important piece of legislation that we enacted was the enforcement of women's property rights. And we all know that, according to Islam and the Quran, and according to the laws within this country, women have clear inheritance rights that must be granted through courts or, through family members, but they're not. And so we came up with a piece of law that ensured that women are now given possession of their property through the women's ombudsperson. And we gave her wide powers, we gave her powers of a court, and we ensured that she involves the deputy commissioner of the area. So more focus on implementation rather than promulgation of a law that gives rights, because the problem in this area is not really promulgation of laws, it is ensuring that laws work in a manner which ensures effective and speedy implementation of people's rights. So that is one area that we reformed for the benefit of the women and girls of this country. And the other is the Legal Aid and Justice Authority Act. So when we came into government, we realized that Pakistan has a lot of legal aid laws spread across a number of statutes and rules. And we then thought about how do we make this area effective and look at it holistically to ensure that there are people in our country who do not have access to justice because they're vulnerable, because they cannot afford the services of a lawyer, and they cannot afford to go to court to demand their rights. So now we have a holistic statute, a holistic piece of legislation which works under the Ministry of Human Rights, which brings everything together. It has a special clause in it which ensures that women and children who are victims of sexual violence get priority in terms of legal aid. At the moment, as we speak, that law is being implemented. We are forming a board under the Minister for Human Rights, and the Prime Minister has committed a huge fund for provision of legal aid to the most vulnerable people across our country. So that is another way of reforming the law effectively, holistically, and towards implementation rather than just granting rights. The other area that we are working on is a reform of the criminal laws of this country, and a reform of the criminal justice system, which is a very tall order, which is a very important task, which is a very complex task. And as we speak, we're reviewing about 78 criminal statutes, including the Evidence Act, to look at what has really gone wrong with our system. Why is that women and girls across our country do not have access to justice? That still today in 2020, we have out-of-court settlements for rape when rape is a non-compoundable offense. Why is that judges and police officers, and in some cases prosecutors, also oversee out-of-court settlements? Why is that every time there's a rape, we call for public hangings and not reforming the criminal justice system? Why is it, why do we have problems like women coming into courts and giving testimony 20 times when once should be enough? So all these problems that have happened over the years, that have developed over the years, the PTI government is trying to involve experts, lawyers, activists, take a broader approach, a more holistic, inclusive approach to identifying problems in the system, and then holistically reforming the law as we speak. So that's where we're different compared to other governments. I wouldn't say other governments didn't legislate. I wouldn't say PMLN and People's Party did not pass laws. They passed very important laws. They passed an important anti-honor killing bill, which was a very good law. But despite passage of that legislation, still, as we speak, in 2020, about 3,000 women every year, according to government figures, are killed on the false pretext of honor. So clearly, just promulgating laws, good laws, is not working for our country. And any government that came in had to come up with a more creative approach that worked towards implementation. And that really is how we are looking at our criminal law reform agenda. And there are other laws that we have also passed but I think the primary areas that impact women is what I have told you about right now.
Right, Maleeka, you've talked about legislation, and my next question relates to the issues that come up when a ruling party decides to bring up a legislative piece into the parliament. So a most recent event that we all witnessed, which was deeply demoralizing, was when the Child Marriages Restraint Amendment Bill was tabled by the government itself, but we saw such fierce opposition from the Treasury benches and from members of the parliament who were, in fact, some of whom were, in fact, federal ministers themselves. Now, this is not the first time that this has happened. Such a bill has been shot down in the past as well due to opposition from hardliners or opposition from right-wing groups. Yeah. And previously, one particular example that I would like to quote as a success story was a contrasting story to what happened to the Child Marriages Bill is the Punjab Protection of Women Against Violence Act of 2015, where we saw severe backlash again from not just within the parliament, but outside the parliament as well. But the bill did eventually pass with a very encouraging majority. Now, my question to you is that this is a recurring trend that we are seeing whenever some pro-women legislation comes to the table. There is resistance from certain sectors, and more often than not, that resistance ends up being more powerful than the people who are introducing the law itself. How is it that your government is looking at this issue, and what steps are being taken in particular to counter this problem?
Okay, so I think that's a very important question, and that puts into perspective the issue of how we are going to protect young girls across our country, and whether we can, as parliamentarians, as public office holders, build bipartisan consensus on the issue. So the bill that you're talking about in question was laid by a PTI member of parliament, but was not a government bill. It was not a government-sponsored bill, but yet again, it was laid on a private member's day by a PTI member of parliament. And what you really saw was divided opinion on an issue that is very polarized in our country. You saw the Minister for Human Rights of Pakistan saying that she supports the bill, members of parliament from PTI saying they support the bill, members of PMLN opposing the bill, and some members of People's Party supporting the bill. So that is how public office holders across our country are divided on the issue of increasing the age of marriage, and that reflected in Parliament as well. And in my personal view, I think it was a sad day for Parliament, because we couldn't build consensus on an issue that is very important, on an issue that should have been dealt with differently, an issue that should have been legislated effectively to protect the rights of young girls, because child marriage is a very important issue. It impacts a large proportion of our country. It should not be allowed under any circumstance, and it's in a non-negotiable, non-debatable area, but despite that, we saw that some members of parliament branded this as a religious issue, and some members of parliament took it as a human rights issue. I think in PTI, there was broad consensus that it is a human rights issue, and therefore the Minister for Human Rights should deal with it. Anyhow, we couldn't build consensus, and right now, as we speak, we're trying to, within our ranks, within our political party, build consensus on it. So we can bring about a government bill, a government-sponsored bill, in which everybody agrees on, everybody, if not everybody, at least a large proportion of members of parliament agree on increasing the age of marriage from 16 to 18. But unfortunately, we have not been able to build that consensus because the opinion is very divided. And within PTI, you see that because, and I always say that very transparently wherever I talk, that within PTI, you find that because PTI as a political party is a composition of many ideologies. You will find many people from a very right-wing background into PTI, and you will find a very liberal, left-wing leaning ideological mindset within PTI, and that is reflected in how we then perceive our policies and how we respond to issues. And I think in a democracy that can never be bad. I mean, if there is division and there is discussion and there is consensus building, there's an area for putting forth views, that is always important in democracies. But I think Pakistan, it's about time that as a nation, we build a consensus on this, that we push forth this area, and through Council of Islamic Ideology as well, which is an important stakeholder in this, try to convince members of parliament across political parties to have a bill that is tabled with consensus of all mainstream political parties and not just PTI. So I guess it's work in progress, and according to me as Parliamentary Secretary for Law and Justice, I would support this bill. The Minister for Human Rights would support this bill. A lot of women would support this bill, but it also becomes, in addition to it becoming a religious issue, it also becomes a gender issue. So you see a gender divide in Parliament. You see men opposing this bill, and you see women supporting this bill. And that's just a reflection of how polarized our society is in terms of protecting the rights of women and girls. And it's a stark reality. It's a sad reality, but it's a stark reality. And more needs to be done by the government to tackle this issue. And we just need to take it head on. But of course, we're in the midst of a political crisis. So I guess priorities are not well aligned. I guess we're not looking at it with the priority that we ought to have done. And I hope that in the near future, we can build consensus on it and bring about this bill with a cross-political party consensus and very little division.
Right. Thank you, Maleeka. Now, obviously, this discussion will not be complete if I do not bring up the recent, very unfortunate motorway incident. And my question to you, before asking the question, I would like to draw parallels between this incident that occurred very recently in Pakistan and a similar incident that occurred in India back in 2012. Now, what we saw in India was a very effective and almost immediate response from the government, which paved the way for some lasting reform when it comes to dealing with rape cases. In contrast to what happened in India, in Pakistan, we saw a very demoralizing response from the security agencies that are responsible for providing protection to the women themselves. Like, we saw victim shaming. We saw that it was done without any fear of accountability. We see that to this day, the person responsible for putting those who are responsible, putting the criminals behind bars, actually questioning the character of the victim and trying to blame her, and no senior member of the government is calling out his behavior. My question to you is that when an incident like this occurs, it is usually a test for the government, and it usually tests not just the government's priorities, but but how sensitized a government is towards these issues. My first question in this regard is, how do you see this as an effective response, or not, I mean, far from a good response, an effective response at all? And secondly, when we see the election manifesto on which the PTI contested its elections, or how PTI has been trying to frame the fact that police reforms or reform of police practices is one of its prime focus, how do you see the conduct of a senior police officer in charge of an investigation or in charge of the security situation of an entire province, when he behaves like this? How do you see, how do you think women in that province or in the country in general can feel safe when going out or just carrying out their daily activities?
Thanks, Sana. I think in relation to the motorway gang rape tragedy, the comments by the CCPO were outrightly condemned by the Minister for Human Rights. I condemned them in my role as a Member of Parliament and as Parliamentary Secretary for Law and Justice. There ought to be no space for victim shaming and policing in this country. And the CCPO was very unjustified in the manner in which he spoke about the actions of the victim. And I think a lot of members of Parliament across the country made that very clear, which then resulted in the CCPO coming out and apologizing because he was issued a show cause notice. But I think what the CCPO said was a reflection of how the police force in our country works. It is a manifestation of the Thana culture that exists within Punjab police force that remains unreformed to date. The fact that women as victims of crimes are not confident in going to police stations and reporting. The fact that the conviction rates for crimes against women are shamefully low. The fact that when victims report crimes, their character and integrity is questioned. So these are all very important areas that require reform, that require reform of the police service, and also the mindset with which police officers across our country work. So we're cognizant of that. We understand that, and we're committed to reforming that area. And I think the public debate on the issue as well has, I think it's been misplaced. You know, I don't see that as a nation we responded effectively to the debate on rape in our country effectively. There was a lot of toxic, I don't know what the right word is, masculine debate on strict crime punishments for crimes of rape and calls for public hanging, when the focus ought to have been on reforming the criminal justice system. You know, the entire argument then shaped on how rapists should be hanged publicly, and not on reforming a system which produces rapists, a system which undermines women's rights, you know. So I think the entire public narrative on rape also needs to change, first of all, but then governments also need to respond effectively, and we are in a very important position, and we have to take the lead on that. And in our discussions within the legal team, with the Prime Minister, with other public office holders, we've come to consensus that clearly the rape laws in our country, however effective they may be, do not work for the victims. You know, I mean, it's an ordeal to be a victim of rape in any event, but when you come into contact with the justice system, that tragedy is exacerbated. That tragedy becomes more complex, and we need to produce and put a system in place that works for them. That means ensuring that the victim is not pushed into giving testimony multiple times, that the victim is not pushed into facing the offender when she's giving her evidence, to ensuring that she has access to all sorts of psychological and legal help when she requires it. And that they are sensitized police officers and prosecutors that protect the victims' rights and not undermine them. So as we're speaking to you, we have a draft bill that is being shaped, that is being redrafted, that is being looked at carefully to put in place a system that produces convictions for rape effectively, but at the same time deals with the victim in a more victim-centered manner. So I think from the government's perspective, we are trying to respond to it with a better piece of legislation and a better implementation model, you know. For example, we are propagating that we should have gender crimes against women courts. So we should have gender courts, because clearly the system doesn't work for women. And every time a crime against women goes into a court, it takes about a decade or 2 decades for that matter to resolve. And that really is not effective. And then, you know, you have very low convictions. So we are now propagating the creation of gender courts for crimes against women, you know, which includes rape, honor killing, kidnapping, sexual harassment, and various crimes. So that has also generated from the discussions that we are now holding. So we're looking at an effective model, and we want to respond to it appropriately. It is our responsibility, and I don't think that in my personal capacity, you know, hanging rapists publicly, which is a violation of the Constitution anyway, would deter this crime. You know, we've put in severe punishments for crimes of honor killing, of other crimes, and we've not seen the crime rates drop. So hanging rapists publicly, that debate probably needs to stop, and we need to come back to the debate on reforming the justice system that works for women and girls, which also includes hiring more women police officers, hiring more women prosecutors, and putting in place more judges that are sensitized to the needs of women, you know. So it needs to holistically work for women. It's a very huge task, and you know, the government is cognizant of that, and we're doing everything we can to ensure that it works. But yes, it's slow work in progress.
Right. Thank you, Maleeka. So since we're a little short on time, we're just going to open the floor for questions now.
Sure.
Members of the audience can raise their hand using the hand. Yeah.
Sure. I'll come up.
We already have a question from Fawzia in the chat. Fawzia, would you just like to say your question out loud, or would you prefer Zainab to read it out? Perhaps Zainab, if you can just say it out loud for everyone who's not had a chance to read it.
Right. I think what Fawzia is trying to ask is that there's currently no mechanism in place for verifying the age of young girls at the time of marriage, especially in rural areas. And she is asking if a mechanism can be put in place which requires verification based on the CNIC of the girl who's getting married.
Yeah, so I think we've discussed this, and the Punjab Commission on the Status of Women has done some work on ensuring that we effectively train nikah registrars, and we also put in place a mechanism whereby nikah registrars who register marriages of underage girls are required production of documentary evidence of age, and if they are involved in registering or undertaking marriages of girls below 16 in Punjab and 18 in Sindh, then penalties should be put in place for dereliction of their duty, for undermining their role. So I think that is the only way forward in my view. If we really want to a system that works in a manner which is effective in rural areas as well, then we need to ensure that people who are registering nikahs or people who are performing nikahs have some obligation upon them to ensure that the victim is of the the girl or boy is of the right age, and they do not undertake marriages which are under the certain legal requirement. And at the moment, the government has, to be very fair, not started any project to ensure that it doesn't take place. But yes, there are mechanisms in place in Punjab which are patchy, and it needs to be more uniform. It needs to be sponsored by the government. It needs to be more effective. And it's a good question, and I think it's something that we should pursue effectively at the Ministry of Law and Justice, provincial levels, and at the federal level as well.
Right, thanks, Maleeka. So we have another question from Mr. Rashid Shafi, and essentially what he's asking is that it's fine to have a difference of opinion inside the parliament over substantive issues, but it's very, very concerning when people who end up being in the parliament show this deep-rooted misogynistic attitudes or sexist attitudes towards women. It is of special concern considering that these people are the ones who will be making laws for women as well, and considering that obviously we have not reached a point where the parliament is a 50% representation or an accurate representation of the proportional representation of women in the parliament exists. It is definitely something that needs to be catered to. So the particular question that Mr. Rashid is asking is, what is your suggestion about changing the mindsets and changing the behaviors? And I think I'd like to add a question of my own to this because it's pretty similar. We have seen in some countries, some European countries, they've introduced gender sensitization programs at school level. So the young boys and girls are taught about being sensitive towards the opposite gender, etc. And that has been found to be very effective when it comes to changing the overall mindset of the society. So my question is that, is the PTI government pursuing a similar agenda, or is something of this kind on in the works where you are changing the curriculum, for example, to with a specific focus on gender sensitization?
Thank you. I think that's a very important question, and that really goes to the core of the issues we face when we're enacting laws that protect women and girls in our country. Unfortunately, the answer to whether we're pursuing such a program is no. We're not at the moment looking at a curriculum that involves guidance and training on consent, on demystifying the concept of honor, demystifying the concept of patriarchy, demystifying the concept of ownership of women's bodies, autonomy, agency, everything that goes to the core of crimes against women. And I think we ought to, as a government, because we're reforming the curriculum, we ought to have also looked at this, because you're right, you very aptly pointed out that it starts at a very young age. Teaching consent starts at a very young age. Teaching young boys and girls that women, are not anyone's honor or property, but are individuals in their own right, also starts at a very young age. And a lot of manifestation of crimes against women that we see in our society today are happening, one, because people do not feel that the system will effectively punish them, and secondly, because it again is a mindset of acceptability of abuse against women. I always say that rape is a violent crime. If you normalize abuse at home, if you normalize beating women at home, if you normalize domestic violence, then rape is a manifestation of the same mindset. The same mindset that abuses women then manifests into raping women, because it's a violent crime, and it's normalized to the extent where ownership, control, and consent, and honor and misogyny all mixed together to produce violent crimes against women. So yes, it ought to start at a very, very young age, and the government ought to start programs which focus on teaching children at a very young age about all these very important concepts. I know the Ministry of Human Rights is doing some work on child labor, doing some work on talking about children's rights, doing some work on preventing sexual abuse, and maybe this is an area that the Ministry of Human Rights could take forward, do gender sensitization within schools, within our universities. In fact, we even need to, at public forums, in talk shows, in universities, in public areas, have discussions on all these thorny, very difficult concepts which we always never talk about, in our country. We really need to open up the debate. We really need public office holders to come out and engage in these conversations and try to build some consensus on it and really discuss it threadbare. But at the moment, as we speak, that's not happening. And I guess it's an agenda that we need to take forward as we move forward in our government. And it's something that I will at least explore with the Minister for Human Rights and with the Minister for Education to see if at this stage we can add something on these lines within our curriculum as we reform it.
Right. Shanza, if you have a question, maybe you can chip in right now.
Maleeka, just going back on something you mentioned earlier, that the CCP apologized, and a key problem in our system is that we have these laws, but that they're not implemented. I am just personally appalled. Why wasn't there sufficient pressure on him and I'm asking you this, not because you're sitting in government right now. Why was he not forced to resign?
Right. I think that's a difficult one because the CCPO is really appointed by the Chief Minister for Punjab. And I think it was felt at that moment that an apology and a show cause notice was enough to reprimand him, to signify that there is zero tolerance for victim blaming within the PTI government at federal and Punjab level. And I think that is probably the thought process behind the decision not to remove him. And I guess at a personal level, I feel that, police officers across our country undertaking victim shaming, you have incidents of victims of rape going to report crimes and then being raped by police officers, and you also have many incidents and reports of crimes where police officers initiate crimes against women, where police officers supervise crimes against women. So, Shanza, it's a complex area which requires deep-rooted reform, and I'm not justifying the CCPO's comments at all. I have very clearly, candidly spoken about it, and my views are very public, that it's unacceptable, and officers who victim blame ought not to be in service. But the problem is that the decision needs to come from a different level and not from one member of parliament. But there was public outrage. Women were angry, and they ought to have been angry. I think the women of this country should always stay angry on how the state is failing to protect women. Yes, at that stage, it was felt that it was enough that he apologized, and it was enough that he was reprimanded, and it was enough that he was not going to make that comment again. But I guess it means us reforming this area more holistically and ensuring that we train our police officers in a way where it's not okay for them to candidly come out and question a woman's decision when she has been raped. You know, we should signify that there's zero tolerance for it. And I think at the government's level, they felt that a show cause notice and an apology was enough to signify that. And for some of us, it wasn't. But for key office bearers within our government, it was.
Right. So my next question is going to be about since gender-based violence occurs in many forms or in many platforms, let's just talk a little about how it occurs on the online space. And very recently, we have seen that female journalists from pretty much all schools of thought have come together to really protest against the kind of stifling of dissent in general that they are facing under this government, and also particularly how female journalists are being targeted and being made the subject of online abuse and harassment. And at least up until now, we have not seen any serious effort being made from the government to address their concerns. So this is something that I would like for you to speak about today. What is the government doing with regards to making workplaces in general safer, and particularly on this issue of female journalists coming together to really protest the kind of abuse that they're facing online and also physically in their workplace? What is it that the government is doing to address this issue?
The issue of online harassment is an issue that is very, very important to PTI, because we are a party that has expressed dissent on social media for a very long time. We're cognizant of the importance of providing a free space for everybody, whether it's women or men, particularly for women, because they're more vulnerable to harassment online. They're more vulnerable to sexism, misogyny. I was myself a victim of all of that when I spoke up publicly against public hangings, and I cited a Supreme Court judgment that has made public hangings unlawful in 1992. I was issued rape threats. I was questioned by ordinary citizens. I was questioned by members of parliament. I was vilified. I was attacked, all sorts. And I had to report all of this to FIA, and very little action. But the problem is that, yes, there is a real issue of harassment of women in public spaces. And the right way to approach it is to ensure that we have an effective mechanism that entertains complaints, that ensures that women who are victims of online harassment have access to legal mechanisms which protect their rights. For example, FIA is an important institution. There's a cybercrime wing within FIA that is undergoing reform, that is adequately staffed, that ought to be better, that should deal with these complaints of harassment effectively, that should ensure that anybody who harasses a woman online, vilifies her, blackmails her, stifles her freedom of expression, faces consequences, which are grave consequences under the Prevention of Electronic Crimes Act. In fact, PECA is a very, very strong law. It was cited as a draconian law when Pakistan Muslim League Nawaz enacted it, but I think it's a law that should be used effectively. And at the moment, it's not being used effectively. There are not enough prosecutions. There are not enough convictions. There is not enough, what is the right word? There are not enough established mechanisms to ensure that women, don't experience harassment online. So the right forum for them would be the cybercrime agency under FIA, and the government should ensure that that agency works effectively. And in addition to that, I think PTI as a government and as a political party has made their stance very clear that they do not believe in harassing or stifling the opinion of women or girls in our country, and that there is a zero tolerance for any form of shaming, harassing, vilification or humiliation of any journalist, whether in an online capacity, whether physically or in any other form. So, from the very top level, from the Prime Minister to the heads of our social media teams, to members of parliament. There's a very, very clear line that has been set out, and the PTI official social media team works according to a certain criteria. You know, they have a code of conduct that they have to follow, and that means not harassing women journalists. But of course, the opinion is polarized when you come to areas like supporters of PTI or supporters of PMLN or supporters of People's Party who are not official members of the social media team, but then go on and harass women journalists. And how do we tackle with them? Well, the best way is to ensure that we ensure FIA to undertake action against them, you know, and the action should move from the state. You know, at the moment, the complainant has to file a complaint and she has to go through a rigorous process and has to attach evidence. But, you know, we can easily ensure that under PECA, the state has powers to initiate action against anybody who's harassing women journalists. We just have to be creative, you know. Under PECA, FIA should have, powers to initiate inquiry of its own accord. It should do that, you know. It should undertake, so there's a very fine balance as well, because you don't want to police people's thoughts, but you have to prevent harassment. So the state agencies have to undertake a very fine balance on ensuring that people have the right to dissent, but when it's harassment, it needs to stop immediately. So the state, I think, should take the lead on this, and women journalists must always, in a public space, feel protected and feel like they have a voice and feel like they can easily communicate their dissent. And anybody, whether it's a woman or a man, should be able to do that in a social media space. And I think PTI government is very clear about that. And we have spoken on it. The Minister for Human Rights has met with journalists. She has also spoken on it. And we've asked them for evidence. You know, I also went and engaged with some women journalists and said, look, if there is evidence of harassment, there is evidence of vilification, there is evidence of any form of abuse, please share it with us, and we will support your applications to the FIA Cybercrime Agency. This really is within our mandate, this really is within our role, and we are behind you on this. You know, whether it's a PTI supporter or a PMLN supporter or People's Party supporter, if they're abusing a woman in an online space, the state has to back them.
Right. So since we are almost out of time now, I'll just take one last question. And like many of us, Fawzia also wants to know, what is the PTI government doing to introduce effective police reforms? Because really no law is effective unless it can be enforced. So I think this is a question that pretty much everybody wants to ask. What is it that the government is currently doing to bring about meaningful police reforms?
Thank you. So I think police reforms stays at the top of the PTI legal reform agenda. Police as an area of law is a provincial subject. So every province has the mandate to undertake legal reform. And I know that there is a committee at Punjab level, a committee that is convened under the Prime Minister that is going through, legal drafts on how we should reform the police service to effectively ensure that the law is implemented. At the moment, we do not have a draft that has surfaced publicly, but yes, we are undertaking discussions. We are looking at different jurisdictions across the globe in which police reform has been effective and implementations of laws has been speedy. So yes, the discussions are ongoing, the drafts are being exchanged, there are committees that have been formed, but I think we need to push it a little. I think this agenda needs to be pushed forward. It needs to be expedited. It needs to be implemented immediately, because it's an area that has been lacking for a very long time, and successive governments have failed, and PTI government came in with the agenda to reform the system. So we ought to take it, we ought to take it as a matter of priority. So yes, there is discussion and reform taking place, but it's probably not as quick as some people would like it, and that is why we face a lot of criticism on this area as well. But not something that is not on the radar. It really is, but it needs to be speeded up.
Right. Thank you, Maleeka. And with that, we have come to the I think we'll conclude now since it's coming. Thank you all for joining us, and thank you, Maleeka, for taking time out and being here despite your busy schedule. And thank you, Chance, for facilitating the conversation. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you everyone for joining us today. A recording of this session will be available afterwards for all our members and on the Harvard website as well. Once again, thank you so much, Maleeka, for taking out time.
Thank you, Shamsa.
And
pleasure's all mine. Thank you.
For moderating the event, Zainab, as well.
Thank you, Zainab. Take care.
Thank you. Bye-bye, everyone.
Bye-bye.